welcome back. I hope you enjoyed your meal. As we emphasized at the beginning, Turkish Marif Foundation opens formal education institutions of all types and at all levels, from preschool to higher education. As a result of official contacts with 105 countries around the world, it carries out education activities in 67 countries. Turkish Marif Foundation continues its activities with more than 50,000 students in 418 schools, 1 university, and 21 education centers in 51 countries. And this happened in just 6 years. I think it deserves a big round of applause. As an international brand in education, Turkish Marif Foundation also works for developing a curriculum and program for preschool education. This is called IM, International Marif. Currently, this program is being piloted in certain countries. Mali is among them, so let's see IM video together.
Uluslararası bir eğitim markası olarak Türkiye Marif Vakfı tarafından okul öncesi eğitim programı geliştirme çalışması yapıldı. Şu an belirli ülkelerde programımızın pilot uygulamalarını yapmaktayız.
Bu program Türkiye Marif Vakfı öğrenen profilinde yer alan özelliklere sahip bireyler yetiştirmeyi hedeflemektedir. Oyun temelli öğrenmenin öne çıktığı bu programda öğretmen ve çocukların başlattığı etkinlikler süresince çocuklara yapılandırılmış destek sağlama ve sürekli düşünce uygulamalarına önem verilmiştir.
Je sais qu'ils sont bien équipés. Eux, ils sont là pour nous accompagner parce qu'ils prennent en charge les enfants de notre pays. Donc, il n'y a pas d'incongruence entre nous et ce qu'ils font. C'est pourquoi d'ailleurs on a créé un lien bilatéral où nous faisons le suivi et l'appui technique avec eux. Donc vraiment, c'est une chose qui est salutaire et vraiment, leur aide ne nous fait pas défaut. Donc c'est apprécié.
Le programme de la Fondation Marif répond alors à la politique nationale de développement de la petite enfance. Quand vous prenez le programme, ils l'ont sorti en 4 axes, 4 domaines. Mais nous, notre programme, nous avons sorti ça en 3 domaines. Mais il n'y a pas de différence puisque les deux prennent en charge le développement cognitif, alors le développement socio-émotionnel, alors le développement physique. À la Fondation Marif, ils ont augmenté le langage. Et nous, on a pris seulement, c'est ce que nous recherchons. Donc, on a beaucoup apprécié le programme comparativement au nôtre et il répond au programme national de développement de la petite enfance au Mali.
Anaokullarımızı programımızda yer alan iç ve dış mekan özelliklerine göre dizayn ettik. Özellikle sınıflarımızda öğrenme merkezlerine çok önem veriyoruz. Matematik öğrenme merkezi, kitap okuma merkezi, dramatik oyun ve blok merkezi gibi birçok öğrenme merkezimiz var. Programımız çocuğun tüm gelişim alanlarını destekleyen, çocuk merkezli, oyun ve etkinlik temelli, yaparak, yaşayarak öğrenmeyi destekleyen bir program.
Ce programme, les enfants ont beaucoup aimé le nouveau programme parce que lors de nos activités, on a eu à faire beaucoup de jeux. Avec les matériels qu'on avait, les enfants ont appris en jouant et ils étaient beaucoup en activité.
Bonjour, je m'appelle Maïga. J'ai 5 ans. Mon jardin s'appelle Marif de Turquie. Si je suis venue à l'école, je suis contente parce qu'on travaille beaucoup et on s'amuse beaucoup. Merci.
Turkish Marif Foundation prepares this very detailed program for the development of children from an early age. And game is a big part of preschool education, as we saw the happiness in 5-year-old Maiga's face. She is so happy to be at school because they are having a lot of fun. Now it's time for the first panel of the day called Back to School. As all of you know, following the coronavirus pandemic, the online provision of education distanced students from school. In order to resume face-to-face education effectively and without interruption, it's necessary to reconsider school. In this panel, the social and emotional development of students in face-to-face education, teacher cooperation, and parental participation will be discussed. Now, I would like to introduce our speakers of the first panel. Please welcome Lera Boroditsky, Professor of Cognitive Science from University of California. Her articles and lectures have influenced the fields of psychology, philosophy, and linguistics. She has received many awards, including NSF Career, MAR, and McDonald's Scholar Awards. Welcome, Professor Boroditsky. Please welcome David Stroupe, Professor of Teacher Education and Science Education from Michigan State University. He is also the Associate Director of STEM Teacher Education at Create for STEM Institute, and the Director of Science and Society at Michigan State University. Welcome, Professor Stroupe. Please welcome Sadettin Ökten, Emeritus Professor and Writer from Mimar Sinan Fine Art University. Professor Ökten carries out many projects as well as educational and research activities in field of structural engineering. He also specializes in the history and philosophy of science, culture, civilization, and the arts. Welcome, Professor Ökten. Please welcome Dionne Cross-Francis, Professor of Educational Psychology and Mathematics Education from University of North Carolina. Dr. Francis has been awarded the National K-12 Promotion of Education Award, the American Psychological Association Division 15 Early Career Award, and the University of Georgia's Young Alumni Award. Please welcome Professor Francis. Dawood Abdulmalek Al-Hidabi, Professor of Educational Sciences from International Islamic University. Founder and former president of the University of Science and Technology, SANA, also the founder and president of the International Association for Talent Development. He works at the International Institute for Muslim Unity as director. Welcome, Professor Al-Hidabi. And last but not least, to moderate this session, let's invite Semih Aktekin, Rector and Professor of History Education and Teacher Training from Nevsehir Haci Bektas Veli University. He served as the General Director of Higher and Foreign Education and General Director of Teacher Training and Development, UNESCO International Teacher Action Force Executive Board Member of the European Association of History Educators. Professor Aktekin, floor is yours. Wishing you a fruitful discussion.
Thank you. Okay, good afternoon. In the morning session, we had very fruitful and effective discussions from policymakers and ministers. We heard about their experiences during pandemic and what kind of problems they have and what kind of policies they implemented during the pandemic. Now we have distinguished guests to hear the academic view. As our presenter says, our session is about back to school. Now we hope that the pandemic is over. Now we are going to continue education by face-to-face education. So back to school means face-to-face education, because during the pandemic we had education only. So we are not saying back to education, but back to school. So face-to-face education. But when we start face-to-face education, we will face new problems, emotional problems, social problems. We need to change maybe our pedagogical aspects. We need to improve new pedagogical tools maybe. So our guests are experts from different fields. Today's our session, we are going to listen their comments on the issues. Our session, during the session, we prepared different questions for different speakers. I am going to ask my questions to speakers. They have 12 minutes or maybe 15 to answer those questions. After we finish the first session, we will have the second round to conclude, to hear their final remarks. Yeah? So now we are going to start with Lera Boroditsky. She's professor of cognitive science. Lera, my questions will be mainly about language development because of your expertise. I'm going to ask, do you think the school closures during the pandemic impacted the students' language development? And how do you think multilingual environments affect children's thoughts? And what should be the role of schools in language acquisition?
Thank you so much. Is the microphone working? Can people hear me? So I had a chance to travel around Turkey in 2020, right as the pandemic was starting. And I noticed that all of the historical sites, all of the incredible sites that I was visiting were actually sites of learning. So mosques, temples, madrasas, everywhere I went that was a great historical site was a place where people had, for last 12,000 years or so, come together. And usually the model was one person stood in front of the class and talked, and the other people listened, right? So that was the model. And in 2020, that model really broke for the first time. We weren't coming together into these places, physical places together. And so it struck me what an incredible aberration that was in our history of education. But of course, these aberrations also give us an opportunity to reflect in historical perspective on how resilient humans are. Because if you imagine what was likely being taught in these spaces, say 12,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, well, a lot of the stuff that was being taught probably wouldn't be part of a modern curriculum. And yet, it got us humans here, right? Humans are incredibly resilient. So even though for many, many years we've been innovating, changing things, the things that we could look back on in history, we'd say, well, those things are irrelevant or silly or wrong, it got us here. And with language learning in particular, humans are very resilient. So if you look across the world's languages, there are about 7,000 languages spoken right now. The way that adults who speak those languages naturally teach or don't teach their children those languages varies tremendously. Now, we all have specific beliefs. So, for example, you'll see American English-speaking parents specifically trying to teach their children language, right? It's not just that they talk to their children. They will say things like, you see, Johnny, this is an elephant. Elephant. Elephant, Johnny. Can you say elephant? This is an elephant, right? And they do this over and over and over again. Now, lots of people don't do this. In some languages, adults don't speak directly to children because, well, the children don't even speak properly. Why would you talk to them, right? It's the other children that talk to children. And then eventually, once they can talk more properly, they can join the adult conversation. In some cultures, people believe that you can't possibly learn the language unless someone directly teaches you the language. I'll give you an anecdote from my family. My grandparents spoke Russian and Yiddish, and they decided when they had kids that they would speak Russian to the kids, but they would keep Yiddish as their secret language. So that's the language they would use to talk amongst themselves when there was something they didn't want the kids to understand. As a result, my father learned only the parts of Yiddish that you're not supposed to say in front of the kids. Because, of course, kids learn language just that they hear, not just language that adults want them to learn, right? So language learning is incredibly resilient. That's the good news. The bad news is that in the pandemic, there was likely a very large separation that happened between families where the adults who were home with the kids had time, had energy, had the education to invest in speaking with their children, spending time with their children, and those families where that wasn't possible for the adults. So the early data we have on what has happened with language learning over the pandemic is some kids actually benefited in their vocabulary learning by staying at home because they were staying at home with smart, wonderful people who really invested in their education and they were spending lots of time with them. But a lot of kids just didn't have that benefit. So the pandemic likely created quite a separation between those who had their resources at home and those that did not. And of course, going forward, the remedy is to try to meet students where they are in their language learning development and start their education at the level that they present when they come back to school. Now, you asked about multilingual environments and the role that multilingual environments have on kids' development. Now, often in language acquisition research, we treat bilinguals as a special case, that, you know, like it's normal to be monolingual, but bilingualism is a special case. That's absurd because most of the world is multilingual. More than half of the world speaks more than one language. Many children grow up speaking many languages. And one of the reasons I would urge caution in making conclusions too early about language development during the pandemic is that sometimes in language learning, experiencing a hardship early on can lead to good outcomes later on. And bilinguals are a great example of this. If you have a child that's learning 2 languages at the same time, if you test them early on in their language learning, you might say, oh, well, trying to learn 2 languages at the same time is bad for kids because they're falling behind in both languages. But if you test them later on in their development, they actually develop fluency, great fluency in both languages, and then they also benefit from all kinds of other things that come with being bilingual. And so if you test too early, you might conclude, oh, this is bad. And in fact, lots of curricula around the world have said, oh, we can't teach 2 languages at the same time, it's going to harm kids. But if you let that process play out and develop over time, it might actually lead to something good. So I think the science on what happened during the pandemic with language development will take time to really mature. The languages that we speak, and there's so many, teach us so much of the wisdom of the people who have developed those languages for thousands of years before us. Let me give you just one example from a language community I had a chance to work with. This is an Aboriginal community in Australia, and instead of using words like left and right, they use north, south, east, and west. And so to speak a language like this, you have to stay oriented. You just have to know which way is which at all times. So let's do a little experiment right now. Everyone close your eyes. And now point southeast. Okay, you can open your eyes. I see points, well, in all directions. I don't know which way southeast is myself, but you guys haven't been very helpful. Don't feel bad. This is very normal. But there are communities around the world where simply the language practices in that community, the fact that you have to use north, south, east, and west to talk about directions, mean that kids growing up in those languages will learn their directions, will be able to point southeast very easily. Now, sometimes teachers from outside of those communities who come into those schools will use standard tests for those kids, and they'll ask them to say, can you point left, can you point right, can you use these basic words? And the kids can't do that because they always use north, south, east, and west. And so the teachers put them in remedial education, and they say, these kids have spatial problems, they need to be put back a grade. When in fact, those kids are able to orient in a way that's better than this distinguished group of people here. They can orient better than professors and ministers from other places, right? And so that to me highlights the acute need for understanding culturally where you are, what the relative cultural ideas are in the place where you are, and creating educational programs specifically for where the kids are. Do I have another minute or?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, 4 minutes.
Great.
I asked about the role of the schools.
The role of the schools, yes. So I obviously kids do a lot of language learning at home. The role of the schools can be to connect kids to the resources that they individually will benefit from for learning second languages or even developing skills in their first language, right? So there are lots and lots of resources available. There are apps that have gamified language learning. There's so many options now to learn if you want to learn. But it takes a curation process. A good teacher will point you in the right direction, will curate for you what is the experience that will benefit you, what are the skills that you need to work on. So I feel like the role of the schools in integrating the incredible richness of information that is available now is the teachers become experts on pointing children in the correct direction so that they can continue to develop the skills that are relevant for them. I had this experience recently. I was trying to learn Spanish. I was in Colombia, and I visited a classroom of students who were trying to learn English, and so we were trying to have this language exchange conversation. And to them, it was so incredible to speak to someone who spoke English, and to me, it was so fun to speak to a room full of students who spoke Spanish. And I thought, why is this so strange? I mean, there's so many people in the world who speak English, and there's so many people in the world who speak Spanish. Just the connection needs to happen. And I'm not inventing something new here. Obviously, these opportunities are possible, but they have to become more liquid. Our classrooms, like that classroom in Colombia of students, exists as its own little island. It's not connected to all of the other classrooms in the world that are learning languages. It's not connected to all of the other people who want to learn Spanish and would want to do a language exchange. So part of the role of the schools is to lubricate that process, is to take advantage of the incredible richness of interconnectedness that we now exist in. I guess I'd like to conclude by saying the pandemic, of course, was an incredibly disruptive event in education. But it's a disruptive event that allowed us to develop and to see opportunities for radically transforming the way that we teach. Winston Churchill says, never waste the opportunity of a good crisis. Something, that's not exactly the quote, but something like that. And this was the kind of crisis that I think created incredible opportunities for developing new ways of teaching and engaging in the classroom. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Lera. Actually, as you said, it was disruptive, but you emphasized the role of the family, actually, by if during the pandemic people have good dialogue with the family members, I think their language development continues. So it shows us how the parental involvement or the family role in the education, yeah? Thank you for reminding us this important issue as well. Thank you. Now we are going to David Stroupe. He's a teacher educator, and during the pandemic, the role of the teachers are, let's say, questioned again because we had digital education, online education. Some people questioned the role of the teacher, right. And even it reminded us the Ivan Illich's, the theory, the schooling to society, whether the next generation won't need the teacher, but the pandemic also shows us that we need schools actually, and we need face-to-face education, and the teachers are the crucial element of the education. So now I'm going to ask you questions about the about the teachers' professional development. How can teacher professional development programs help teachers so that they can better support students returning to school during this area? Yeah, and you are professor of science education. That's why I'm going to ask you another question. What are the possibilities for STEM post-pandemic? And what are your experiences motivating and engaging students in STEM education after the pandemic?
Yeah, thank you for those great questions. So to your point, I mean, one of the jokes in America became that some people would argue that teachers are no longer important, but maybe if you ask some families and parents who were really tired of trying to get their kids to stay on the computer, maybe teachers are very important, right? So there's always a role for the teacher. So to the first question about teacher professional development and the kinds of supports that teachers need, I think after the pandemic, there's sort of three big lessons that I think we could really implement when we think about supporting teachers. The first one is that we need to think of professional development for teachers as part of a web of support, as opposed to sort of a single source of change. So we know that teachers need better pay, they need better professional support, they need to be positioned differently in society and really valued. And professional development can help with that, but it's only one part of a larger solution that a lot of people in this room who are ministers of education, who are policymakers or administrators, you're in great positions of power to help create these better systems of support, of which professional development is a part. The second thing that we know from decades of research about professional development is that our sort of typical one-shot workshops, or maybe teachers come to some kind of intervention design for a few days, we know that those maybe last for 1 or 2 classes, maybe a week before teachers discard them and try something else. So if we really want professional development to work, if we really want the idea of supporting teachers to be something that teachers engage in regularly, teachers have to have a voice in what they're learning. They have to be part of a community of learners that's engaged in problem solving together. And we have to encourage them to take what I think about as pedagogical risks. So working with students, we've seen some wonderful videos already of students being asked to sort of take direction of their own, of taking charge of the content that they want to learn. That sounds really lovely in a video, but for teachers, that's a really scary thing to ask because there's a lot of uncertainty involved. So the professional development that we have to help support teachers with has to encourage them to take these kinds of risks in which they'll let children do the kinds of wonderful things that we see in the videos. The third piece is that we need administrative support, both locally, at sort of state levels and at national levels, to support teachers in changing what they think and learning together. So often teachers are required to engage in some sort of professional learning, and if we had administrative support to encourage them to learn together, to learn across institutions, to learn over time instead of just doing it very quickly, if we had that kind of administrative support, if teachers felt safe that they were allowed to engage in this kind of learning together, we might see some different results in terms of what professional learning allows teachers to engage in. So, the second question is a big one about sort of possibilities for STEM moving forward. And I have some big ideas, but I would like to engage with you in thinking about these as well. So to your point about you never waste a good crisis, right? So the first idea about some possibilities for STEM is that it's a really good chance for schools to imagine what STEM is and how schools fit into this broader picture of what counts as STEM. We are moving as sort of a society, we're encountering what some sociologists of education think of as wicked problems that can't just be solved by one person, one community, or one discipline. So think about COVID, think about the climate crisis. These are really big problems that even extend beyond STEM. And so thinking about moving STEM learning in schools away from an individual endeavor and towards a collective effort to create change could be really important, and schools can play a role in that, but I think that's one possibility. Another one is for schools to help students ask hard questions about what counts as STEM. So often when you're especially in my world of the science classroom, students are often told that these are the great scientists of the world, here's the work that they've done, but they're never really asked why those people are positioned as great scientists. Or they're never allowed to ask why are these people included in the pantheon of great scientists, but other people are not. And maybe people from my community are often excluded from these conversations. So schools offer a place for us to ask really complex questions about who's allowed to do STEM, what kind of impact should STEM have on communities, who is allowed to participate, who's allowed to create knowledge, And even moving forward, what is our relationship with the natural world? I think that's a really important question. The next sort of possibility, I think, for STEM is to learn with and from the communities of people who have been engaged in really fascinating, complex STEM work, who are not often recognized as doing professional science, quote unquote professional science. So a lot of the innovations that I think we'll need to have moving forward to encounter and solve some of these really looming problems that are these wicked problems in the world will come from local communities who are doing immediate problem solving to fix things or innovate things that they need done quickly to make sure that their community survives. And I think STEM has a lot to learn from those communities because often professional STEM, as much as it likes to think it changes quickly, it doesn't. It takes a long time for sort of STEM to change. Even quick innovations that we imagine, like the COVID-19 vaccine, was a very fast sort of innovation in terms of professional STEM. But even that took a year or more to sort of develop, and it was built on knowledge that had been developing for years based on previous vaccines. So as a field, as a STEM field, we have a lot to learn from communities who are engaged in this very local work that matters to them and that they can change quickly because they have the necessity to do so. So finally, to me, one of the big questions and one of the things that it makes me excited about working with teachers, especially STEM teachers moving forward, is that, and a possibility for STEM, is that they really get to empower the next generation of people who will have to work on these problems. So we're getting older, the people in this room, we're getting older. And at some point, we're passing the responsibility for our mistakes onto the next generation. And so because we're asking them to take on these tasks and often the problems that we have created for them, I think the least we can do is help empower them to know that they can make change and to help us fix the mistakes that we've made. So I think a really interesting possibility for STEM, especially in science classrooms, is to help students see that change is possible, even at a very small level, and to really empower them, even at a small level, to know that they can take on the responsibility and that they have the power within them and within their communities to create the change that we're going to need. The third question to me is a really big one as well, which is about motivating students in this sort of new post-COVID era. To me also, this question really is at the intersection of my work, which is around science education and teacher education. Because I think we have to move beyond the idea that teaching is delivering content, that teaching is memorizing information, that teaching is engaging in these entertaining performances on a stage, and that as a teacher, I'm supposed to know everything about the world, and I'm supposed to impart my wisdom to you. So we've already heard from some panelists and from some videos that as a field, we're moving beyond the idea that teaching is any of those things, and more towards the idea of teaching as facilitating these powerful opportunities for students. So to me, that's a really important first step in helping to motivate students, is to help students see that schools and classrooms are different than what they've experienced and different than what they imagine, especially having been online most recently. When I work with my future science teachers, I think one of the most important lessons at a really fundamental level that I hope that they take away and that I work with them to develop is at the very most important thing they can do with students in schools is to help acknowledge the students' humanity and to see them as really important people. So everything else we want to accomplish in classrooms, in STEM classrooms, learning equations, learning about cells, doing any sort of the things that we think students should know and do in science classrooms, none of that matters if the students don't think that the teacher cares about them, if they don't think that the teacher values them as a human being, if they don't think the teacher sees them, their ideas, their experiences, and their communities as being foundational for the work. So I really try and work with my teachers to listen closely to children, to really value what children have to say, to think of children's ideas, experiences, cultures as resources to build on, and as the building blocks of school and STEM and science, as opposed to things that the teachers are supposed to fix or correct. Because if we block those avenues for students to make sense of the world and to engage in this learning together, they will never, ever want to participate in the STEM that we hope that they will, because they don't think that we care about them and their humanity. Another important thing that we can do to help students in STEM classrooms, especially around motivation, is to really disrupt and ask hard questions about equity and about who's been allowed to participate in STEM fields. So again, students see posters on the wall of often white men scientists as being held up as the norm and the great scientists. And they may not see themselves, or they may not see their communities as people who are allowed to participate in STEM fields. And so as a community, we have to ask questions about why they don't see themselves there, and how can we really shift what counts as science and what counts as who can be a scientist. And that helps motivate students to feel like they are allowed to participate in the fields at all. Finally, students want to do work that has meaning to them. And ideally, they want to do work that has sort of immediate and long-term benefits to both themselves as learners and some community that they feel a part of. So the community might be local. It might be when they walk outside their classroom, there's a science or STEM problem that they want to try and solve right there. The community for them might be something really far away. Maybe you're teaching students that want to design the next Mars rover, or want to design something that's going to go to Jupiter. Maybe that's the community that they want to be a part of. But they want to do work that they think matters, that they think will help solve a problem, and they don't want to do work that's artificial. They don't want to do work that's memorization. They don't want to do work that they only know will be assessed on some standardized measure that then gets discarded and they don't have to worry about anymore because the measure is over. So they want to do work that has meaning in their lives. And to me, that's where teachers become very important, because they provide students with these opportunities to engage in this work. Teachers can openly question the curriculum and standards that we think are really important for students. They can design opportunities with students and with STEM professionals to engage in data collection together. So in an example of that, I have a project right now where I'm working with a professional entomologist, so someone who studies insects. And we're going into classrooms with science teachers, and together we're designing insect research. None of us know the answers to the questions we're asking, not even the professional scientists. And that's part of the joy that the students are finding, is the scientist saying, I don't know the answer to this question. But we're going to do real science. We're going to engage in authentic work because real scientists ask questions that they don't know the answer to. So instead of having students memorize facts about animals, or having students take an assessment where we can gauge something that they know based on standards that we think are important, we're having them ask questions that are authentic for whatever the communities are that they think are important. And we're helping them learn how to design research and data collection and how to analyze the data. And none of us know what's happening. And it's beautiful to watch and engage in because we're participating in real science together.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, you have important remarks. I mean, the teacher development and in-service training is very important in Turkey as well. Maybe in the morning session, you noticed, or Deputy Minister emphasized that Turkish Ministry of Education invests a lot on in-service training. In the modern literature, although we talk about teacher autonomy, as you emphasized, teachers are also human. They need support from either administrative level or from parents or students. They also need support. And we need to encourage them to solve the problems in the schools and, to make the education more beneficial for students. As your recommendation on STEM also, I think, valid for all the subjects, yeah? If we treat students as a human, if we value them, if we care about them, they will not learn STEM effectively. Also, they will learn other subjects as well, I think. Thank you, David. Now we go to psychological aspect of the education. Diana Cruz She's a professor of educational psychology. Then I am going to ask you questions about the emotional or social development of the students and teachers as well. So, what problems are commonly experienced in returning to school and adapting to face-to-face education after the pandemic, do you think? My another question is, what can be done to compensate for learning loss in mathematics after the pandemic? Because she's also a professor of mathematics education. And what are the pandemic's impacts on teachers' social and emotional development, do you think? What are the responsibilities of education stakeholders in this regard?
Thank you. So one of the first big problems, I think, one thing that I mentioned earlier in our conversation with a colleague was that the pandemic didn't just happen in Turkey, and it didn't just happen in the United States, but it was really a global experience. And I think all of our partners here and collaborators are coming, and they know one of the major things that we're struggling with is the learning loss of students over the time that they were not in face-to-face classrooms working with teachers. So even though there were accommodations being made for students who were not in classrooms with teachers virtually engaging with students, a lot of countries had model lessons that they provided access to students. There were a range of different things. There were parents calling students at home, doing lessons over the phone. All of them seem to have fallen short of what students would normally get in face-to-face interaction. And if we think about it, a lot of them required resources that not all students were able to access. So not all students had internet connection. Not all students had mobile devices that they could access those lessons, whether it's a computer or a tablet or an iPad. So even if those resources were provided through the schools or the districts, there were still students who were not able to access those learning resources. In addition to not being able to access the resources where they were provided, some of those resources were just not appropriate for particular students at particular grade levels. For example, at the time, I had a 4-year-old. And if anyone had a preschooler or a kindergartner, you know how the thrilling experience it was trying to have them sit in front of a computer for even 30 minutes. So even the resources that were provided were inadequate for particular groups of students. And even for those, and even if you had a teenager, no one, not even us, wanted to be on those Zoom meetings for more than 45 minutes at a time, much less all-day schooling. So there was tremendous learning loss across multiple subjects. But for mathematics and science and reading, which are the ones that tend to be, elevated to the top, there was particularly significant learning loss because they spend a lot of time in schools working on those particular subjects. So going back to schools, teachers now had to face the typical issues that they have with supporting students in these subjects, but having lost a year to a year and a half of learning, and then now in this new space, transitioning from a virtual environment to a face-to-face one. In addition to just learning loss, the learning loss was particularly significant too because we oftentimes have these achievement gaps. So in the US, we have significant achievement gaps between students who are affluent, who are usually white, and students of color who are often in schools and communities that are underserved or on the lower socioeconomic spectrum. And so in this particular time, those who had the resources and had the means had opportunities to access those means, whether it was through getting tutors in the home or their parents could provide that support. And for the students who typically struggle and who are underserved in our education system, they did not have access to those resources. So not only was there learning loss overall, you found that there was a widening of the gap. Teachers generally have to differentiate in classrooms because if you're an educator, you never get students at the same grade level in any class. But we are taught how to kind of differentiate to attend to the needs of the range of academic experiences of students. Now imagine that that has doubled or tripled in terms of the diversity of where students are when they come into your classroom, depending on the subject that you're teaching. That means that the the way that you have to structure and teach your class is different from what you were experiencing before before they were shut down and students went to virtual spaces to learn. Another thing is dropout rates. So some students are returning to school, but because of the economic challenges that were experienced by some families, some students, they didn't go to school or they didn't attempt virtual learning spaces because they had to become no support systems for their families. So they stopped engaging with school, stopped going to school, and in returning to a face-to-face platform, they just did not return to school. And so it's now dealing with how do schools and teachers now try to re-engage students who have now had to deal with economic challenges faced by the pandemic. It seems like a non-school issue, but it really is because those students are still within school age and the school has a responsibility to try to pull them back into the community, the school community, and then to educate them where they have been disconnected from that environment for a year or more than a year. A third and significant issue that has, I think, always been there, but we have not necessarily attended to it in a really systematic way, are the social emotional needs of our students. I would say over the last 3 to 5 years, even prior to the pandemic, the social emotional learning and social emotional needs of students have become, we've had greater awareness around those issues in North America and in other countries as well. The pandemic and recognizing that students' social and emotional development was very connected to the experiences that they had in school, there became this real heightened awareness around the mental health of students and how to actually address that. So students coming back into school, that's a particular significant challenge in terms of dealing with what are the social and emotional challenges that they're having re-engaging with school. There's the idea that school is the best place for them. It supports their social emotional needs, but imagine young children who've been at home with their parents for the last year and a half and the attachment that they have bonding with their families and their parents at home and now being pulled apart to now trying to re-engage in this space where they are all these strange new people. So although we think that it's more beneficial for kids, we also have to be aware of the challenges of what that means to now be taken away from a space that is now your home space, but also your school space, into this other space that is now quite foreign for those young children. Another issue is the data would tell us that there was a lot of there was an increase in traumatic experiences in the home in terms of abuse, et cetera, with parents and students and children being at home for these long periods of time. And the children were there and experiencing those particular traumatic events. So they're coming now to school with a range of different kinds of experiences that they had while they weren't in school that were for many exacerbated because they were in their homes for extended periods of time. And now teachers and the school system now have to deal with reacclimatizing students into the school environment, also coming back to attend to some of the experiences or residue of that trauma that they experienced in the environments that they were in while they were out of school. This is also kind of connected to the third question, and I think I'll just integrate both of them in terms of thinking about the social and emotional needs of teachers as they are also coming back to school. So one of the reasons that the mental health of student is a particularly significant challenge is that a lot of teachers aren't supported in developing in their own social emotional development. They're not really supported in how to handle and deal with crises for themselves, and therefore are not necessarily well-trained or supported in how to re-engage or deal with students who are going through particular kinds of trauma, extreme anxiety, panic attacks, stress, etc. So teachers are coming back to school, and in the US, a lot of them were particularly stressed out because they were being expected to return to school when they didn't feel like it was safe to do so. And that's not only experienced in North America. I spent some time in Ghana, and it was a similar situation in West Africa, where teachers were being mandated to come back to school, and they still felt like it was really hazardous to their health and their families. to have to re-engage and connect in a space where they were still having surge of COVID-19. And so that was particularly stressful for them, as well as having to deal with, again, the learning loss and dealing with dropout of students, et cetera, coming back into that space. So what are some of the things that we can do to kind of, or what we should be doing to support teachers in their social emotional development? One of the reasons it's really important is that the data would suggest that if students in classes of teachers who are socially emotionally healthy and who have had that training tend to do better. Teachers and students in schools where their leaders have social emotional training also tend to do better and are better adjusted, and they have healthier experiences in school. So in general, having a community where the individuals who are supporting the children have had this kind of training and support, it tends to create better spaces for learning, not only for students, but also for teachers to work. So it's important if we want to have really engaging and safe spaces for students to learn and where they can learn most effectively. So we want to also think about this as in short-term ways and also long-term, the benefits of this. We had one global pandemic. Unfortunately, it won't be our last. And this is not only the only crisis that we might see in North America, not so much in other spaces, but we're also dealing with school shootings and a range of different crises. And so we also have to think about that, the pandemic, if we're gonna make use of it, I'm gonna draw from here, in terms of thinking about the long term, that we need to try to create an infrastructure where we're supporting teachers in developing the skills that they won't just need now, but that they'll continue to need in order to support themselves, in order to create spaces that are going to be beneficial for their students. So we want to provide support for school staff and teachers to be able to identify, interpret, and respond to the personal crises of students in terms of their anxiety, their stress, suicidal ideation, abuse, neglect, all of those things. And it can't just be the one or two professionals in the school space. It can't just be the school counselor or the school psychologist who is responsible for this, because we are seeing more and more incidences of students coming in who need this kind of support. We also want to invest in teachers developing their own social emotional skills. So not only learning about how to support students, but also in terms of their own identity development, their ways of emotional regulation and management. Teachers who are stressed out often pass on that stress and burnout to their children. So we want to create spaces not just for them to be able to manage and to regulate that, but to be able to interact with students in ways that do not pass on those kind of unproductive emotions to them. Some ways of thinking about doing that are provide spaces for students, for teachers to actually engage and talk about whatever crises they're going through. So that might be peer support groups where they're talking to other teachers about the experiences, and they can come up with solutions that will benefit not just them, but the school community as a whole. In particular communities, affinity groups are useful. So teachers who are of particular religious affiliation, that might be particularly helpful. Teachers who identify ethnically in similar ways because they're going through similar trauma. For example, again, in the US for Black teachers, while they were going through the global pandemic, there was also the murder of George Floyd, which for a lot of people, it felt like there was a double pandemic going on. Creating those affinity groups where teachers can actually get together and talk about their experiences are ways for them to help to manage the trauma that they're experiencing and also create a support system for them within the school environment. Another thing that's really important is sometimes we think about, and I'll pick up on what David said, in that sometimes there's like this one-time treatment whenever there's an issue. So there's a crisis, there's a pandemic, let's kind of put a Band-Aid on it. But recognizing that we have to think about long-term solutions for long-term problems, and that when we provide support for teachers, we also need to check in so what we've provided is really actually addressing the problem. So there are these programs that come in, we support teachers for 2 weeks or 3 weeks, and then it's done and they move on. But no one comes back at the end of the semester to say, how is that working for you? Are there other issues that are arising? Coming back at the end of the year and doing regular check-ins, and then modifying the program if it's not really meeting the goal in terms of supporting teachers. There has been a max exodus in several places. I was just visiting West Africa and in North America of teachers leaving the classroom. It's not that teachers have stopped loving kids or have stopped loving teaching, but they really don't find classrooms and schools as healthy places for them for a range of reasons. And so this is not an optional issue. It really is an issue that is another crisis that has developed that is really important that we focus and really attend to if we want capable and competent people in classrooms supporting our students. Okay. Another thing that can be really helpful for teachers in this space is to get support in thinking about how to actually care for themselves. So what does self-care mean? I think sometimes when individuals are going through trauma, they feel like they need help, but they don't really know where to get the help or what that help looks like. And sometimes that information is really useful to not only necessarily work in the professional space, but how is it that I take care of myself holistically? So not only making them aware of what it is that they're experiencing, but also making them aware of what are some of the resources available and how they can actually engage in ways of caring for themselves. And then also, how does that work within the professional space and outside of the professional space? I think one thing that sometimes we forget, and I'll put this in an experience that I used to have when I would teach high school, and for the educators in here, you may have had a similar experience when you would go into a space that was not school, like a supermarket, and your students would see you and they would be shocked because how could you be in a supermarket? You live at the school. So sometimes we forget that teachers are not only professionals in the school, but they also have personal lives that they are trying to balance and manage with their professional experiences. And so the stress that they're experiencing, the burnout that they're experiencing, it's not only related to the school environment, but remember, teachers were also at school with their own children and with the children, with your children, and having to navigate that as well. And then transitioning back into school, they're now having their own children in spaces with learning loss as well, and then having an exacerbated experience with students coming in. And so providing the resources where they can help to manage and balance those experiences overall is gonna be really important. And we have to keep sight of that we can't just be concerned about them in the spaces where they benefit us, but also consider them as the humanity of the teachers, and that we also have to care for them holistically. I want to kind of focus a little bit now on mathematics education. And the second question, what can be done to compensate for learning loss in mathematics as students transition back into face-to-face environment and for teachers as well? I think one thing that's really important is to not pretend that there wasn't learning loss, that we didn't actually lose a semester up to a year. I think a lot of spaces have continued to just move along. So if they were in 3rd grade when they were at home, then they come back and they're in 4th grade. Well, not really. Or 4th grade can't really be 4th grade as it was before. If we want to make sure that we have space for new students coming in, then 4th grade has to look a little bit differently than what 4th grade looked like before the pandemic. It was really interesting when I was in West Africa, and there were countries there that had actually acknowledged that and decided that they were going to act on it. So in January of this year, they were actually starting their fall semester. So they didn't pretend that students weren't out of school for the whole year. They were like, well, we lost the whole semester, so let's just start as if this is a new semester. And it disrupted everything. They had to create an entire new exam structure. They had to redo the entire calendar. And that was not just K-12 schools, it was also the university as well. And what they did was that they created a calendar where they shortened the time off for students. So they would have less breaks, and then they had year-round schooling. So over the course of the next 3 to 4 years, that's what they will do in order to get back on track with the typical term or semester system. And I thought that that was particularly, brilliant, because it really, in some ways, accounted for what they knew happened and what they knew they wouldn't be able to address meaningfully if they continued as it was. So I think that's something that we want to not only say happened, but actually acknowledge that in practice, and see how it is that we're going to attend to that. And it means changing particular structures, right? It can't just continue with, they're gonna come back in school, and we're gonna have the semester in the same way, and we're gonna go on the same breaks, and we're gonna have our exam schedules in the same way. That benefits a system, but not necessarily one that has the best interest of teachers and students in mind. Because what that does is that it creates unrealistic expectations for what they can achieve over the course of a year. I speak specifically about, in this case, about mathematics because that's my area, but I think that it also probably transcends into other subjects as well. And one of the ways it becomes particularly salient in mathematics is because a lot of the foundation ideas are needed in order to move to the next level. So the way mathematics is structured, it's hierarchical in a lot of ways, and so it builds. So if you've really missed a lot of concepts in 3rd grade, like multiplication, and building multiplicative reasoning, it's gonna be really difficult for you to start working on fractional ideas and algebraic ideas as you get into 5th and 6th grade. And so, like, missing a year of instruction is going to have repercussions long-term for you as you get into higher level math, which becomes then a major issue not only for the student and their ability to achieve, but also strengthening the STEM pipeline, which is also always a big issue in terms of what we want to do.
Okay, Dionne, maybe you want to continue in second turn?
I will wrap up right now.
Okay.
So I just wanted to leave with just a couple of things that we can think about in terms of addressing the learning loss that we have and how we can support mathematics. So one of the things that the data has shown us that's been really useful for mathematics, not so much reading, is to provide tutoring. And I think when we think about tutoring, we're thinking about, okay, this one person who is particularly sharp at math working with one student. It really just means someone who has greater knowledge and competence in mathematics supporting students in a smaller, more intimate space where they can support their needs. And I think there are ways that we can structure schools so that students can have that additional time, not additional time with a whole class, but additional time where they have more focused learning experiences around the needs that they need to be attended to.
Okay. Thank you, Dionne. Actually, I mean, the socioeconomic level of, you reminded us that the level of the students, differentiation and diversity is key issues also in Turkey as well, because different people have different needs and the pandemic affected people differently. So that's why I think the inclusive education policies are very necessary in everywhere, in Turkey also as well. So our ministry recently initiated a lot of projects on inclusive education because people have different needs, as you mentioned. And as you emphasized, the self-care is also very important. Unless we help ourselves, we cannot help others. So that's why in order to help the students, teachers should have a healthy, personality, and their emotional and social and psychological and mental health also very important. Thank you for reminding us this as well. Now, I'm going to ask the similar questions to Dawood. He's also professor of educational psychology. I think, Dawood, you will also going to talk about how can the learning losses due to pandemic be compensated? What is the solutions? What are the alternatives?
Yes.
And what are the pandemic's impacts on students' social and emotional development?
Yes.
Dionne mentioned about teachers' social and emotional development. I think we are going to ask you about the students' social and emotional development. What are the responsibilities of stakeholders in this regard, do you think? And very important, what's the family's role in lessening the pandemic's adverse effect on students? What do you think?
Okay. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah, wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'm quite happy to participate in this conference, but let me create a balance because my colleagues were talking more on the United States. I'll be talking about 80% of the world population, including the country I came from, Malaysia, and other countries. Yes, I heard from our colleague that even in America, there is a digital divide between particularly those who are at disadvantage, like the black people. But I will be talking about those who are not even black, who are at disadvantage everywhere in the world. And the pandemic disclosed the unethical dimension of world people because they have not paid attention to those who are suffering. I could hear that Elon Musk was ready to zoom in the satellite to offer internet to certain countries for political reasons. But I cannot find Elon Musk zoom the satellite to offer access to infrastructure in the internet for the poor people. I think what I would say that our children in schools in the most of the developing world deprived of their own freedom and education human rights. It is a must to offer and to access education equally to everybody. And you could see that this unfair environment in the world, even at the level of those what they call themselves, United Nations countries and others, who claim to serve everybody in the world, but they serve only a minority. So we have to look for fair and equal access, democratization of education. This pandemic has disclosed the selfishness and the lack of human rights in this world. We could see that our children face neglect, abuse, and gender-biased violence. They contribute to the greater anxiety and emotional distress, not at the level of the students, teachers, parents, neighborhood, everywhere. Everybody is suffering. All stakeholders are suffering. And also, there is no easy access for any therapeutic and social work services, particularly for those who are in need. Let alone if we talk about these children with disabilities, let alone if we talk about the children of immigrants who do not have enough education or even language proficiency. They cannot access information or resources. So we are talking about something which is great, which need a global partnership. Yes, local, national could help, but it will never, ever be sufficient to bridge the gap and the deficiency in offering quality education. So people physically, mentally, socially, emotionally, and in general, well-being of people. I'm not worried really about the academic and learning alone. We have to care for the holistic development of people. We need people to be happy and successful in their life, not only to achieve certain scores and results. We are looking for human touch, human care, not only thinking about academic achievement and let people suffer in this world. Even families, as you know, and research has shown that challenges like divorce, violence, family conflict, mental and psychological problems, drugs, health, lack of income, stress and anxiety, all of this affected every family in the world. So we have to restructure policies. We have to restructure even curriculum, because it is unprecedented, it is unexpected for all of us. And I'm sure, whether we like it or not, we are going to face more crises and more risk. We have to have inbuilt mechanism of crisis and risk management in our educational institutions and in our societies, so that we can help our societies. And we have to create awareness among the whole world to work together to help our own people. We are living on the same planet Earth. Everything is affected by our decisions, wherever we are, regardless of our culture, religion, languages, or what have you. Our children become uneasy to deal with. They become more aggressive. They have problems of maltreatment from even their home. They have social isolation, intimate partner violence, and parental substance abuse. Domestic violence become common. Children are physically abused, neglected, emotionally abused. So all these kind of suffering, I'm talking about social, emotional, psychological, mental well-being. So what is how to compensate it? It is a must to mitigate, to reduce the intensity and the level of suffering through offering services to families, teachers, and students. We have to support educators to acquire social skills, relationships, and how to manage behavior management. Educators also want to be trained for providing effective online instruction, support special learning language and behavioral needs. We need to improve access to mental health resources and consultants to improve physical and social well-being of our students, teachers, and families. In fact, we are all a learning community, whether at home or students or teachers. We have to work together as one family. Parents and caregivers are stretched thin between managing their own work and their children online learning. So I think also even employers should adopt flexible policies for working parents so that they can spend quality time with their children. And we have to train them how to manage their children, how to help them. State and local partners should develop culturally sensitive assessment. Also, on academic and social emotional development so that we can offer services to fulfill the exact needs of our people. We have also globally worked together to develop research, to develop open source applications and platforms and resources in different languages so that we can help the world. There are a lot of NGOs in the world. We can work together, let alone if the states are not working, but there are international NGOs. We have to work and to realize and shoulder the social responsibility towards human beings by offering free access to internet, develop materials, train teachers, provide open source software and application platform so that people can minimize the impact, the negative impact of such kind of epidemic or pandemic or even for future crises. Also, we have to create new ways of assessment across the different subjects, school subjects. Maybe focus more on authentic and alternative assessment rather than knowledge-based assessment. So we have to think also the school curriculum to focus more on the most core things which would help people to become better citizens and also pursue their education in the future. We have to train parents. We have to do research and innovation in the area of more effective learning, more effective technology. We have to motivate non-government organizations and private sector to help globally people to develop resources. And we have to also establish and help integrate internship and training into organization in the field. We have to adopt holistic and integrated balanced approach to mitigate the great negative effect to improve the well-being of our students. And if we care about that, we have to adopt also global approach into developing whatever needs to be developed to improve the well-being of our students. Also, I think we have to conduct research on digital technology to facilitate virtual learning. We have also to provide more therapeutic counseling services. We have to fight unfair discrimination, marginalization based on ethnicity, religion, language, and income. We have to adopt hybrid modes of learning and also to focus more on what is needed in the market, like something related to professional certification with some of my friends in the next maybe panel discussion will be talking about it. We have, in short, to restructure the system in general. Finally, regarding the role of the family, I think we have to help them how to reduce risk of physical and psychological harm for their children, more effective social interaction and active listening to their children, ensure access to good food and nutrition, the provision of immediate care and protection to children to ensure well-balanced and integrated personality development and effective learning, plan and implement social activities, engage in open conversation to release student feelings, listen and give full attention to their concern, be alert to the prolonged online connection and ensure to protect them from any digital harm, keep in touch with kids' education institutions for coordination and collaboration, and ensuring access to therapeutic and consultation services for all, and attending training programs to improve parents' care and support, and forming neighborhood parent support groups to exchange experiences of effective children care and support, giving more quality time with the children. By doing so, hopefully we can work together globally and try to reduce and mitigate the negative impact of today's post-pandemic problem as well as the future crisis and risk. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Thank you very much, Dawood, for reminding us the importance of social justice.
Thank you.
As you mentioned, the pandemic disclosure of the problems, but also it shows us we should fight together to have a fair world. Yeah, the education is one of the main tools of this fight. Yeah, thank you. Now we have Turkish speaker, Emeritus Professor Sadettin Ökten. Hocam, sözü size veriyorum.
Teşekkür ederim.
Hocamız eğitimin insani boyutu konusunda bize konuşmasını yapacak. Hocama doğrudan soru yöneltmiyorum. Öğretmen vasıflarından hareketle çeşitli örnekler vererek konuşmasını yapacaklar. Buyurun hocam.
Efendim bir metin var, onu size okuyacağım. 3 muallimin öğrettikleri, metnin başlangıcı bu. Esas itibariyle 3 muallimden öğrettiklerim olacaktı ama çok öznel olur diye biraz bilimsel bir renge büründürmeye çalıştım. Pasif cümleler kullanmaya çalıştım. Okuyacağım. Sonra belki hatıralara vakit kalırsa. Bu sonum buradaki havanın biraz dışında olacak. Kusura bakmayın. Uzun yıllardan beri bilimsel toplantılara katılmıyorum. Böyle. Bu sunumda Türkiye'de yakın tarihte görev yapmış 3 lise mualliminin deneyimlerinden derlenen hatıralar üzerinden bir eğitim usulü takdim edilecektir. Burada özellikle muallim kelimesini kullanıyor ve öğretmen yerine. İlk muallim Mahmut Celalettin Ökten, 1882-1961, İstanbul Darülfünun'unu 1912'de bitirmiş ve 1913 yılında o zamanki adıyla İstanbul Sultanisi'nde muallimliğe başlamıştır. Bu zatın medreseden mezuniyeti ise 1918 yılındadır. Darülfünun'da edebiyat ve kelam sertifikaları yapmış, medresede ise hadis ve tefsirde uzmanlaşmıştır. İcazesi var. İstanbul Sultanisi'ne başlayan lise öğretmenliği 1947 yılında Vefa Lisesi'nden emekli olmasıyla son bulmuştur. İkinci muallim olan Abdullah Mahir İz, 1895-1974 İstanbul Üniversitesi Edebiyat Fakültesi mezunudur. Klasik şark kültürüne ait dersleri hususi hocalardan almış, Türkiye'ye gelen müsteşriklerle temas etmiş bir edebiyat muallimidir. Emekliliği 1960 yılında Haydarpaşa Lisesi'ndendir. Üçüncü muallim ise nüfus kaydında Osman Nuri olarak adı geçen ama kendisinin kullandığı şekliyle Nurettin Topçu 1909-1975'dir. Bu zat İstanbul Erkek Lisesi'nden mezun olduktan sonra Strasbourg Üniversitesi'nde felsefe ve sanat tarihi lisansı yapmış, sonra Sorbonne Üniversitesi'nden doktor unvanını almıştır. Türkiye'ye döndükten sonra muhtelif liselerde öğretmenlik yaparken hazırladığı tezle İstanbul Üniversitesi tarafından doçentlik payesine yükseltilmiştir. Bu sunumda bu 3 zattan derlenen bilgi, deneyim ve hatıralar birleştirilerek bir bütün halinde ifade edilmeye gayret edilmiştir. Bu 3 muallimin ne göre bilgi, bilim ve ilim hiyerarşik bir sıralama gösterirler. Bunların üçü de sadece insana mahsus olan ve Allah tarafından lütfedilen birer olgudur. Eskilerin tabiriyle Hazreti İnsan bu olgunun tek öznesi ve muhatabıdır. Bilgi, bilim ve ilim bu zevatın da ifade ettiği gibi üzere İslam medeniyetinde vurgulandığı şekliyle Allah'ın Alim isminin yeryüzündeki tecellisidir. Dolayısıyla bilgi, bilim ve ilimden yola çıkılarak Alim ismine doğru yol almak beşer için bir imkan, aynı zamanda bir inayet ve aynı zamanda bir zarurettir. Muallim, ilim öğreten kimseye verilen addır. İslam medeniyetinde ise ilim yukarıda da zikredildiği gibi Allah'a nispet edilmiştir. Dolayısıyla ilim alim isminden kaynaklanır. İlahi ilim yani Allah'ın ilmi duyular ve duyular ötesi alemi kapsamakta ve bu ilim bunların hepsini bilmektedir. Eski tabiriyle ariz ve amik. O her şeyin hakikatini ve mahiyetini bilmektedir. Zaman ve mekan sınırı olmaksızın küçük büyük, gizli aşikar her şeyi ve her olayı bilir ve alim isminin müsemması olarak bazı kullarına dilediği kadarını bildirir. Yukarıda adları zikrolunan 3 muallim, bilgiyi, bilimi ve ilmi bu çerçevede anlamaktaydılar. Bilgi, bilim ve ilim hiyerarşik bir yapı gösteriyordu ve ona giden bir yol idi. Bu açıdan bakıldığında sistematik bilgi ile kalbin bilgisi olan ahlak arasında hiçbir fark yoktur. 3 muallim kendi talim ve terbiye faaliyetlerinde bilgiyi, bilimi ve ilimi böyle anladılar ve talebelerine hem ilim hem de ahlak, talim ve terbiyesi verdiler. Onları da beyan ettiği gibi maddi ve manevi bütünlüğü içeren bilgi ve ahlak varoluşun özü ve kaynağıdır. Zira insan eylemleri kadar vardır ki buna düşünce ve duygu da dahildir. Bu eylemler de insanın bilgi sınırlarıyla hudutlanmıştır. Tekrar hatırlatmakta fayda görülür ki burada bilmek olgusunun içinde zihin ve kalbin bilgisi, sistematik bilgi ve ahlak birlikte girmektedir. Yukarıda sözü edilen 3 muallim için öğretmek ve öğrenmek mukaddes bir eylemdir. Onlar hayatları boyunca hem öğrettiler hem de öğretirken öğrendiler. Çünkü bu iki özellik sadece insana mahsustur ve Allah tarafından verilmiştir. Aynı zamanda ona giden yolu da oluşturmaktadır. Karşılarına gelen talebeye, yani genç, temiz ve masum zihinlere ve kalplere bu anlayış ve duygusallık ile hitap ettiler. Talebeyi ve zamanı, yani ders süresini kendilerine tevdi edilmiş bir emanet olarak görmüşlerdir. Mektep onlar için adeta bir mabet idi. Sınıf da bu mabedin bir köşesinde genç zihinlere ve kalplerle birlikte ibadet edilen bir mahal idi. Kendilerine tevdi edilen ilim öğretmek ve ahlaken örnek olmak gibi kutsal bir vazifeleri vardı. İlim öğretmeyi ve ahlaken örnek olmayı karşılarındaki genç, temiz ve masum zihinlere ve kalplere doğru, saf ve nezih bir biçimde aktarmanın sorumluluğunu ve hassasiyetin taşımaktaydılar. Böyle kutsal bir ruh hali içinde derslere başlamadan önce bir ibadet sürecinin ön şartları her neyse onu titizlikle yerine getiriyorlardı. Ders sırasında ise ibadetin kurallarına dikkat ve hassasiyetle riayet etmekteydiler. Karşılarındaki genç zihinler ve kalpler, adını koyamasalar bile bu hassasiyeti fark ediyorlar ve onlara büyük bir saygı duyarak gönülden bağlanıyorlardı. Talebe onlara emanet idi. Sınırlı bir zaman süresinde ve belli bir mekanda olabildiğince ilmi birikimi ve ahlaki donanım ile teçhiz edilmeliydi. Diğer yandan her öğrencinin ve tabii ki bunlardan teşekkül eden her sınıfın belli bir ihatası, kavrayış kabiliyeti ve anlayış derinliği vardı. Yukarıda sözünü ettiğimiz 3 muallim, terbiye ve talim hayatlarında her zaman itidali seçmişlerdir. Her bir öğrencinin ve sınıfın zihni yeteneğini ve kalbi derinliğini bulup ortaya çıkarmak muallimin vazifesidir. Öyle ki bu muallimlerle ders yapan bir öğrenci bir süre sonra kendi varlığında bulunan gizli cevheri keşfetmeliydi. Bu zevat adeta bir hazine arayıcısı gibi her gencin varlığında ilahi bir lütuf eseri olarak saklı olan cevherin peşine düşmüşlerdir. Zaman zaman çarpıcı bir parlaklık görerek çok heyecanlanıyor ve bunu birbirlerine bir müjde olarak ifade ediyorlardı. Onlara göre her sınıfın bir vasatisi vardı ve bu vasatın bir sınırı olmak icap ederdi. Muallimin vazifesi bu vasatiyi bulmak ve bu sınırı tespit etmekti. Muallim, talim ve terbiye faaliyetinde bu vasatinin altında kalırsa kendisi işi itibariyle tembellik etmiş olur, sınıfı da tembelliğe teşvik etmiş ve tembelliği mazur göstermiş olurdu. Bu vasatiyenin üzerinde talebeden bir şeyler istemek ise onlara eza vermek ve onları sıkıntıya sokmak anlamına gelmekteydi. Önemli olan talebenin ciddiyeti, gayreti, çalışması ve 3 muallimin üzerinde çok durdukları istikametiydi. 3 muallimin talim ve terbiyedeki davranışı çok kez kendi ihate ve kabiliyetlerini tam manasıyla kullanmalarını gerektirmemekteydi. Fakat yukarıda tanımlamaya çalışılan öğretim usulüyle muallim, ilim ve ahlakla birlikte talebeye numune olmak mecburiyetindeydi. Talebeden de bu örnekliğin bir karşılığını, bir aksini, bir yansımasını beklemek haklarıydı. Öğrencinin davranışlarında gerek ders dışı, gerek ders içi devamlı bir kontrolleri vardı. Bazen sade bir bakış, bazen bir söz, bazen daha ileri giden bir ihtar ve ikaz mekanizmasını daima çalıştırıyorlardı. Ancak her 3 muallimin de vakar ve ciddiyet perdesiyle sırlanmış ve dışarıdan ilk bakışta görünmez bir müsamahaları olduğunu da söylemek icap ediyor. Yukarıda sözü edilen hususlara ilave olarak şunu da söylemek gerekir ki, bir muallimin çok önemli bir vazifesi daha mevcuttu. Bu da her sınıfta nadir de olsa vasatın üzerindeki zihinleri ve kalpleri keşfetmek, onlara bir yakınlık kurmak ve bu bakir, saf, temiz ve güçlü alanları olabildiğince işlemek idi. Bu 3 muallim, nadir görülen zihinler ve kalpler üzerinde hususi bir dikkat, gayret, rikkat ve hassasiyet içindeydiler. Zamana çok dikkat ediyorlardı. Çünkü genelde mezuniyetten sonra muallim-talebe ilişkisi bitmekteydi. Bu kısıtlamaya tabi olmayan çok ender rabıtaları heyecan ve coşkuyla birbirlerine karşı dile getirirlerdi. Bu özel zihin ve kalpler bu 3 muallim tarafından mektep içi veya mektep dışı her fırsat ve vesileyle işlenmeye, eğitilmeye ve donatılmaya gayret edilmiştir. Hatta 3 muallim özel fırsatlar icat ederek bu eylemlerine devam etmişlerdir. Mekan olarak ev, mahalle mescidi, cami, kütüphane, kıraathane, yazları mesire-i çay bahçesi, hatta mütevazi dernek odaları kullanılmaktaydı. Bu çatılar altında özel bir talim ve terbiye gerçekleştiriliyordu. Zaman olarak ise her mevsimde, özellikle tabiatın cömert olduğu aylarda şehrin banliyölerinde bu faaliyete devam edilmiştir. Bunlar, muhatap olan talebenin ihatasına ve tekamülüne göre ilimde ve ahlakta birlikte yürümüşlerdir. Tıpkı küçük bir çocuğun elinden tutan ve onu gezdiren bir yetişkin gibiydiler. Böylelikle zihnin açılması, yani düşüncenin tekamülünü ve kalbin derinleşmesini, yani duygusallıkta engin ufuklara açılmayı sağlamışlardır. Vasatın üzerindeki gencin zihnen ve kalben erişemeyeceği eserler ve isimler ile onları tanıştırmışlardır. Bu eserleri kısmen de olsa birlikte mütalaa etmişler, bu isimler hakkında ortak çalışmalar yapmışlardır. 3 muallimin yaptığı diğer bir faaliyet ise, bu genç zihni kendi imkanları içinde erişemeyeceği üstadlar ve seçkin çevrelerle tanıştırmak olmuştur. Böylelikle bu üstadlar ve çevrelerle temasa gelen genç, bir başka aleme doğru açılır ve yükselirdi. Şehirde medeniyet ve kültür alanında çok özel ve birikimli etkinlikler olurdu. 3 muallim, parlak ve genç zihni ve kalbi bu etkinliklere de dahil ederler. Hatta bir kısmına birlikte katılırlardı. Sonra her şeyde olduğu gibi burada da bu süreç sona ererdi. Genç mektepten mezun olur ve hayatına bir başka istikamete devam ederdi. Muallimle özel talebe artık ortak mekan ve ortak bir zamanda birlikte bulunamazlardı. Ancak her ikisinde de huzur ve itminan duyguları içinde hatırlanan özel zamanlar ve hatıralar kalırdı. 3 muallim için bunların en güzeli ise kendilerine tevdi edilen kutsal emanetin parlak bir zihne ve duygusal bir kalbe, yani ehline emanet edilmiş, teslim edilmiş olması idi. Efendim.
Çok teşekkür ediyoruz hocam.
Estağfurullah.
Özellikle medeniyetimizdeki ilim, bilim, irfan konusuna olan bakış açısını, eğitim, öğrenci, talebe ilişkisini bize hatırlattığı için hocamıza kıymetli konuşmasından ötürü çok teşekkür ediyoruz. Dear speakers, now we have 20 minutes to finish our session. So I'm going to give you 2 minutes each to have your final remarks. Yeah? We can go by turn again. We start from you, Lera.
Thank you so much. There's so many interesting ideas that I resonate with. I want to end by pointing out a few ideas that my students have come to me with post-pandemic, and also things I hear a lot when people are trying to learn language. And I don't have solutions for these problems, but I'm putting them out here because there are a lot of brilliant minds in this room, and I think if we all think about these problems, good things will happen. So the first kind of ill-formed idea that students come to me with is the idea of being already behind. They say, well, I've lost all this time, I'm already behind, and they feel discouraged because they feel like they've lost all this time. With respect to language learning, for example, people might say, oh, it's too late for me to start learning a new language because, you know, you have to learn when you're a kid and it gets so much harder when you're an adult. And that's true, it does get harder to learn as you get older with respect to language. However, unless you have a time machine, there's no better solution than to start now, right? The very best time to start learning is now. And so there's this idea of being already behind that is completely unhelpful in learning, right? It's just something that you have to throw away and say, well, I'm just gonna start where I am, I'm gonna start now. And so whichever way we can support students in that idea, in just kind of throwing away this idea of being already behind, I think we liberate them to start learning from wherever they are. The other problem students come to me often with are goals that are ill-formed. So they'll say, if I start learning this language now, which is they've decided is too late, I'll never be native-like. So what's the point? I'll never be native-like. And I always say, well, why do you want to be native-like? Are you trying to become an international spy? What reason could you possibly have for that to be the only goal, perfection, right? Because there's so many other levels of mastery that you could achieve in any subject that would be wonderful, would be great. So again, freeing our students and ourselves from these impossible goals or striving for perfection in a way that prevents us from even starting to do things. So how do we free our students from those kind of ill-formed goals? The other idea that my students come to me with is kind of related. They say, well, I've lost 2 years. So it almost feels like they want to give up because they've lost 2 years. But these timelines we have are completely arbitrary, right? So I tell them, when you're 45, you're not going to care if it took you an extra 2 years to do this coursework. It's not going to matter. In my own experience, I started school in the Soviet Union. I did 5 grades of school in the Soviet Union. Then I didn't go to school for a while my family and I were refugees. And I started in 8th grade in America in a completely different educational system, in a new language. Everything was weird. I'd missed everything, right? But now it doesn't matter. Now when I look back on it, I say, well, yeah, I lost years, but who cares now? I learned things in the end. The point is not to have stayed on some fixed curriculum. The point is to arrive at some set of goals that you like, to master the set of things that you want to master. So how do we help our students not feel like, oh, they've lost 2 years or they have to stick to some particular timeline? How do we free them from that? And the last are the barriers that institutions create, and we're part of these institutions where we have these fixed curricula, and you say, well, you have to pass this test, and if you pass the test, then you go on to the next class. Well, that's a problem in 2 ways. One is passing, okay, let's say you got 70% right on an exam. Well, that means that you didn't get 30% of it. Maybe you need that 30% to go on to the next part. I learned to sail recently. Now, I want to know that when I go out on the boat, I don't just know 70% of how to sail a boat. I want to make sure I don't die at sea, right? So how do we, as institutions, create curricula that are tailored specifically to the goals, not just about passing or failing, holding people back, but actually encouraging people to think about mastery of the stuff that's important, and not worrying about fulfilling arbitrary goals that may not be important to them. So I hope you think about some of these things, and I know that brilliant ideas will come if you do. Thank you.
Thank you, Lera. David, would you like to add any?
Thanks to everyone. And I think I'm going to echo some thoughts of people, and it's always interesting to hear from you. So I'm going to conclude with 4 thoughts. 2 of them are for, I think, so the people who most immediately live in schools. So teachers, administrators, folks who interact with children on a daily basis. And the first one is, I know we have important work ahead, and we really need to sort of disrupt entrenched notions about who can learn, who can be successful, but really also whose forms of knowledge and whose experiences are important in school. So again, we've set up these sort of artificial standards, we set up these artificial timelines, we set up these artificial ways of measuring what we think we want to know from students, and post-COVID is a good time for us to question those assumptions and to really welcome students into classrooms differently than we have in the past. The second sort of thought for people who most immediately interact with kids is we even just sort of thinking about the physical classroom or the physical school space, we really need to think about how and who we invite in, who we support and how we support them, and who we exclude, whether we explicitly or purposely exclude people, which many schools across the world have done in the past, or whether maybe more problematically we implicitly or tacitly exclude people. And I think we're having some important conversations here and elsewhere about how we need to make sure that we welcome students, their lives, their communities, their cultures into school as the foundation of the work. So those are the first 2. I cannot also pass up an opportunity. I don't always get to talk with policy people, and I don't always get to talk with ministers of education. So I have 2 sort of concluding thoughts if you're in sort of those positions of power, and they're more pleas or more begging than they are thoughts. So the first one is we really need, and this is to build on your point, we really need new ways to collect evidence of student learning. And internationally, we like to rely on these standardized measures like the PISA exam. In the United States, we have something called the NAEP exam, but really they are under the umbrella of standardized testing that some policy person or some group of policy people think are important. But we know from decades and decades of research that they simply don't reflect what kids know. They simply don't reflect what teachers are capable of helping students learn in classrooms. So my plea to you is, if you're in a position of power to do something about this, to please have conversations, to please reimagine how you want to gauge and provide evidence of student learning locally, nationally, and internationally. And I know that's a sticky question, and I'd be happy to help think with you about that question. The second sort of plea to people in positions of power, sort of in policy land, is we know that rhetorically we are asking for big solutions to complex problems. And as someone who lives in classrooms with students, as someone who prepares teachers for this kind of work, my plea to you is if you ask for big solutions to big problems, we need big resources and big funding to get it done. So instead of hoping that we'll generate research on our own, instead of asking or wanting to support projects that you think will be successful, take risks. Take risks in funding. Ask teachers and students and communities to innovate together and fund that work. Instead of knowing the outcome ahead of time or worrying about whether those will increase the standardized test scores, which I don't think measure anything anyway, take a risk as a funding agency, take a risk as a government, and help us on the ground do the work in communities with students, with teachers that will have an impact, and use it as a case of, an exciting example of, that might generate future funding. But don't just fund projects that you know will be successful in the end. Help us take on these complex problems in communities by taking risks in terms of funding. So thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you. Dionne?
Thank you. I just want to thank all the panelists. Really, really good ideas for us to ponder and think about. And I want to give a special shout out to all the teachers who are here today. You are probably my favorite people in the world, and I'm glad that you're here. And I'm excited to see you and to listen to your panel when it comes. One of the things that I try to do sometimes when I do speak with others is to center myself and kind of talk a little bit about my identity. And I promise I'll do this in a very, very short span of time, because I think it allows you to see the lens with which I look at things from and probably understand my perspective. So I'm Jamaican, I'm an immigrant, I live in the US, but I've also had the opportunity to visit several countries during the pandemic. I was in several states in the US, I was also in Ghana, I was in Jamaica, and I was also in South Africa. And also seeing these countries as they transition to having kids back in school. And one, although very different countries, very different cultures, struggling with the same problem, right? Trying to stay on a similar trajectory for most of the spaces. And what do you see with all the countries that are trying to stay on the same trajectory of learning is that there are some who benefit and some who don't. And so my question is, who benefits if we continue on this trajectory? In some ways, talking about the fact that there are issues related to pandemic, but not really actively addressing the issues that were related to the pandemic. And it's those who have always not benefited from education, right? And across our countries, those people probably look different. In the spaces that I'm in, they're generally students of color who look like me or of dark skin. When I go to the continent, it is on the continent of Africa, it is those who have means and those who do not have means, right? In other spaces, it is immigrant population. So across your terrain, there are a lot of immigrants coming in. They're the ones now who are not really gonna be the ones who benefit if we continue on a similar trajectory. All over the world, those who are disabled are also the ones who tend to get left behind. So when we think about if we don't modify things, if we don't address and deal with students where they are, who benefits and who loses, and it's those who have always benefited that will continue to benefit, and the ones who really need us to serve them get left behind. I had a child at home during the pandemic, and she had a reverse effect. She didn't fall behind, she went ahead, because she had 4 grown-ups, 2 retired grandparents, and an educator, and a father who's very interested in education, who she had all their attention. So she was actually propelled ahead. That is not the typical household, right? I mean, there were students who were in different kinds of spaces and didn't really have those resources to draw on. So again, I'm thinking those are the ones we want to think about. How can we modify and change the trajectory so that we're serving them? If we put the student at the center when we're making decisions, then we think about those who are closest to the student, right? So it's the teacher. Teachers have to show up in spaces where they are also able to be healthy, where they want to be there. So we have to make sure that in the same way that we're attending to the needs of the students, that we're also attending to the needs of the teachers. And they also need to have and be supported in developing the knowledge, skills, capacities, and competencies that they need to work with the students in really progressive and healthy ways. So again, I'm going to draw on what two of the panelists talked about. Like, we need different kinds of resources, right? We need a different way of supporting teachers. The old kind of professional development, not going to work. The way that we're distributing our resources and the kinds of resources that we're providing, we're in a different trajectory now. So those have to show up and look differently. So we want to start to kind of rethink. We're in a different space. I think that's where we all landed today. That's where we are. We're in a different time that we haven't navigated before. And so we might want to think differently about the solutions that we're trying to address and not try to import old solutions that were designed to address different kinds of problems, but think about innovative ways of using the resources that we have, generating different kinds of resources, and thinking about the health and support and development of our students and teachers in ways that are going to benefit those who have oftentimes been left behind. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Dawood.
Well, I've got only 3 concepts. Number 1 is more support. When I say support, it is emotional, social, academic, technological, everything, for the family, the student, and teachers. So support. Number 2, global partnership, sharing and learning to help and to make our offering more effective. Number 3, adopting a holistic approach to the well-being and learning of our students. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Today you became the voice of Dawood and disadvantaged people. Thank you. Hocam, son olarak eklemek istediğiniz?
Yok, sağ olun, teşekkür ederim.
Peki, teşekkür ediyoruz hocam sizlere de. Dear participants, now I want to finish the session. Before I finish the session, I would like to thank all of our distinguished speakers for their great contribution. What I learned today, just if I summarize, after post-pandemic era, we have long way to go, yeah? I mean, to create mentally, emotionally, psychologically, socially healthy condition and environment for our students, all stakeholders, policymakers, academics, teachers, families, politicians, all of us, we need to cooperate, we need to work together for our future. Together, we are stronger. We agree? Yeah, also, thank you for... We don't have question session, so... No, sorry. We have to close... Do we have... I think we have to finish the session, but you can ask your question after the session to our speakers. Sorry? Yeah? Okay. Also, thank you for your patience and active listening. We have... Also, thank you for Maarif Foundation to organize this excellent event, to give us opportunity to share our ideas for all of you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I also would like to thank to our moderator and speakers. It was really illuminating. Obviously, there is a lot of work to be done and issues to be resolved for the post-pandemic back-to-school process. Before you leave, we will have special gifts for you. I would like to invite the member of Board of Trustees and the Vice President of Turkish Maarif Foundation, Professor Dr. Ahmet Emre Bilgili, present the gifts to our President. Panelists. Hepinize. Professor Stroupe. Buyurun Sayın Ökten. Professor Francis. And now we can take a family picture. Please, professors.